Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss something that's most likely going to be happening on planet Earth in the next few years. A massive anomaly that you see behind me that's now brewing in the Pacific Ocean. Something that some scientists are now referring to as Godzilla El Nino, also known as Super El Nino. And though this might sound like some kind of a science fiction disaster movie, right now the data behind this is actually pretty real. And the effects from this will be quite serious in certain locations on the planet. And so in this video, let's actually discuss exactly what El Nino is, why this particular El Nino seems to appear just a little bit extreme, and what this very likely means for the overall weather patterns on the planet in 2027, 2028, and beyond. But in essence, based on some of the recent forecasts from the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, we now have a pretty clear picture that El Nino is definitely approaching, and that the overall temperatures in the Central Pacific seem to be increasing way more than before, and way above average temperatures that we usually expect around the same time this year, with some models suggesting the increase by about 4 degrees Celsius, which means that if these numbers do hold, we're looking at one of the strongest El Nino events in the last century, and potentially surpassing historical records in 1997 and more recently in 2015. But before we dive into numbers and the discovery, let's talk about what exactly this is and why a patch of water in the Pacific Ocean seems to then dictate what happens in regions in North America, South America, Australia, and Europe, and dramatically changes various weather patterns for at least several years. And so let's dive into the science of ENSO, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and discuss these latest studies. And so all of this basically happens right here, literally in the middle of the Pacific. And in some sense you can think of this region as a kind of a giant bathtub. Now usually, when there are no major events, there are actually a lot of winds going westwards. We usually refer to these as trade winds. Basically winds blowing from the east to the west, or from South America toward Indonesia and Australia. And these winds tend to push a lot of warm surface water westwards, basically causing a kind of a warm water pileup near Australia and Asia. And as warm water moves west, a lot of cold, nutrient-rich water rises from the deep ocean somewhere near the coast of South America in a process referred to as upwelling. And this basically keeps the Eastern Pacific relatively cool, filled with nutrients, and actually filled with fish. While at the same time the Western Pacific remains kind of warm and also produces a lot of rainy conditions in this region. And this is normally referred to as the neutral phase. This is actually what we have right now when I'm making this video. But sometimes we also get two additional stages or two additional phenomena with opposite results, El Nino and La Nina. And when El Nino begins, these trade winds either weaken or even reverse completely, with all of this massive warm pool of water in the west now starting to slide back towards South America and stopping the upwelling of cold water, which actually completely reorganizes the entire climate in this region and completely changes weather patterns, starting in the Pacific first. But this also creates a kind of a feedback loop referred to as Bjerknes feedback, with weaker winds creating even more warm water in the east, which then weakens the winds even more and makes the water even warmer. And so this cycle tends to continue for several months until this warm water eventually depletes and the system resets. And though normally these changes in temperature are not particularly large, sometimes just 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, in certain cases, during certain events, the temperature increases so much that it then creates major climatic changes on the entire planet. And that's because El Nino is a kind of a global heat injector. As a matter of fact, more recently in 2023-2024, one of these events contributed to the hottest year on record. Actually, several locations on the planet recorded peak temperatures in certain regions, all basically the result of the El Nino from just a few years back, with the 1997 El Nino even killing approximately 16% of all corals due to the phenomenon referred to as bleaching. And that's because it doesn't just affect the Pacific region, it actually ends up shifting weather patterns across the entire planet, but in somewhat different ways depending on the location. and even depending on the time of the year. And while usually in South America, so countries like Peru and Ecuador, there are going to be a lot more floods and a lot more extreme rainy conditions because the warm water fuels massive thunderstorms. In contrast, Australia and Indonesia experience the opposite. The rain moves east, and so in these regions there's a major risk of drought and even bushfires, which is exactly what happened in Queensland in the late 90s. This was officially the worst drought on record. Whereas in North America there's a kind of a split. In the south and in the Gulf Coast there's usually a lot more wetter and cooler winters, while the northern states and Canada actually experience much milder, drier conditions. And so as you can see from this image, quite a few individual regions on the planet become affected by this in completely different ways. But why call this particular event Godzilla? Or why is this basically called a Super El Nino? Well, this nickname is often used for El Nino events that show extreme sea surface temperature anomalies, such as the ones that have now been determined in 2026. This new data shows us that there is now an 80 to 90% chance for such an event to form in the next few months. Suggesting, of course, that in the next few years, specifically 2027, 2028, and possibly beyond, a lot of different regions are going to be experiencing extreme weather patterns and possibly once again some of the hottest days on record. With the other worrying observation being the fact that we just actually had El Nino a few years back, and there seems to be another more powerful one on the way. And a lot of atmospheric scientists now believe this might be connected directly to major losses of the Arctic ice in the last few years that's now making El Ninos much stronger and much more frequent. Although we're actually not going to know for sure for at least a few more months. But interestingly, this is not just going to affect the weather, it's obviously also going to affect the economy and the production of food on the planet. Just to give you a kind of an extreme example here, a similar Super El Nino that happened over a century ago, the one in 1877 and 1878, actually resulted in a global famine that killed over 50 million people. This was referred to as the Great Famine of 1876 or the Northern Chinese Famine in Asia. Now, as of today, this was still the strongest El Nino ever, and since then we've obviously improved our ability to produce food, so we're a little bit better prepared, but even a minor famine is going to dramatically increase humanitarian costs because certain regions are definitely going to be hit pretty hard. Although from a slightly different perspective, the 2014 El Nino surprisingly had a somewhat positive effect on the economic activity in North America. And so countries like the US and Mexico actually saw a very small boost in GDP because of an increase in agricultural yield in certain regions. In contrast, India and South Africa basically had the opposite. There were more agricultural troubles and thus GDP fell. Which basically means that, I guess, some countries will benefit from this, some will not. But once again, in 2026, one of the main reasons it's actually referred to as Godzilla event is also because of the dramatic change that's happening very fast. Because compared to previous transitions here, we're actually seeing a very rapid shift from the cooling La Nina phase to this extreme warmth that's observed today, which basically gives a lot of ecosystems and of course a lot of farmers a lot less time to adapt. And that means that in the next few years, there might be some trouble ahead, at least for certain countries. But obviously it's also called Godzilla to kind of raise awareness and makes a story about climate just a little bit more interesting. Although in this case, this is a real-time data, and the strength of this El Nino is definitely not exaggerated. But it's also important to mention that a typical El Nino is not a guarantee that something will happen. It just increases risks for certain climatic conditions, but does not guarantee that, for example, a drought is going to happen in Australia. It might happen, or it might not. However, the sea surface temperatures right now have a very high chance to reach the record high, and will thus have at least some effect somewhere. We just don't really know exactly where yet. And so at least for now, the only thing we know is that El Nino is coming, and probably in the next few months. On that note, once we have some updates about planet Earth, we'll come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support the channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.